All righty. Like I said, I'll check periodically and grab you guys on the chat. I love questions and I love the interactiveness of these presentations. So please do ask questions. One thing I'd like to ask everybody, if you would, just type in your agency and your experiences with relocation, if any. I'll check that here in a minute. But today's agenda, I'll do a quick introduction here in a second. We're going to go through some relocation issues, some triggers, Uniform Relocation Act requirements, and then talk about some of the nuances with RAD and some of the other conversion programs like Section 18 and also HUD 8BB transfer, which is something that I've recently got in and been able to work on. And then talk about some process concepts, and then we'll wrap it up with some Q&A. So my first question on the introduction slide here is, who are you and what do you do? So I'm gonna pop down and see what kind of responses I've gotten from folks here, and then we'll get back to the slides. So feel free to type in who you are and what your experience with relocation is. And then while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Chad Wakefield. I own and operate a company called Revival Development Services, based in Phoenix, Arizona. The area, I actually live in Chandler, but most people know Phoenix. They don't necessarily know Chandler. And I go across the country doing relocation planning and implementation. I'd say 50% of my clients are public housing authorities and 50% are affordable housing developers, and have worked on a lot of RAD projects since its inception in 2012, have worked on a lot of Section 18 conversions, and over the last couple of years have worked on RAD and Section 18 blends. We also just work with a lot of developers who are either recapitalizing and renovating affordable properties that are financed with low-income housing tax credits, or are converting to that program, and kind of everything in between. A lot of properties now are gotten to the age that they needed to be torn down. The condition is such that a renovation may not even make sense financially, and so a lot of buildings are just getting taken down. And so the topic of relocation has really turned to permanent relocation or a long term. And so there's much more focus on HUD's part and state housing finance agencies on making sure that residents are being taken care of in place rehabs, but also where there's possibility that they may have to move away permanently. And the rules are different, and what's required is different, as we're gonna get into in just a second. Okay. So a couple things on issues. What do I mean by relocation? So these are the main bullet points we're going to get into here in a few minutes as we go along. What do I mean by relocation? Why is it important to get it right? And why is getting it wrong a problem? And then also, what do I find is most confusing typically? What we're talking about today in terms of relocation is doing a kind of a mass movement of people, if you will. So not the type of activity that you may do under your ACOP, where you may move somebody from a larger unit to a smaller unit because of qualification, or needing to move somebody out of a unit because maybe it floods or there's an electrical problem. I'm talking about moving people in mass for a project purpose where there's federal financing, federal participation in a project, like a redevelopment or a renovation of that property. The relocation I'm talking about, it could be permanent, it could be temporary, it could be in place. What I mean by in place is where the construction program has work happening between, certain hours of the day where the residents can come back at night. So it may be a conversion of the, bathroom for some accessibility features that, that work can be done, 8 to 5. Folks come back at the end of the day, that kind of thing. That's an in-place rehab. And if you're using federal funds, that still triggers the Uniform Act, still triggers the requirement to plan for that activity and take care of the residents. Why is it important to get it right? Well, to me, the biggest thing is your reputation and your credibility and your funding. All right. As a public agency, you're there to serve the public. You're using public dollars. You're using other public facilities, and so it's very important to maintain your reputation in the community, in the affordable housing community, as well as your local community. So reputation is on the line if you're getting things wrong, and reputation is enhanced if you're getting it right. Your credibility, again, your public dollars, public trust, people need to have faith and believe in what you're doing. And so if you do things right, your credibility is enhanced and in good standing. If you don't, it could be in jeopardy. And lastly on this, your funding could be at stake. If you do things wrong and you cut corners and potentially even purposely avoid portions of the law, you could jeopardize federal funding that you're getting for that project, and also your ability to go in for more funding on other projects in the future. So that to me is the first group of issues of why it's important to get relocation right, and do it by the book, but also do, as I'll touch on later on, what's reasonable to make sure that your right isn't correct. Honestly, the way that things are heading right now, there's so many conversions and redevelopment of assets. I think relocation is almost always involved in some way. If nothing else, just a conversation of, are we impacting the residents? Do we have to do anything? What's required is in the conversation on almost all projects, it seems. And it's people first, right? You're talking about your residents. Many have been with you for decades. You want to take care of them. You want to ensure their safety. You want to ensure that their families taken care of long term. And so it's important to get it right if you have to put them through a relocation event. People first has really become a mantra at conversions, as it should be. And it's the right thing to do. And it's the right thing to do to take care of people. And so the right thing to do and take care of people is to get the relocation program right. Technically accurate, but also meeting the needs of folks and reasonably taking care of their needs. Why getting it wrong is a problem? Well, you could lose funding. You could lose your trust and your credibility in the community, the local community, but also within the HUD community, the affordable housing community. Getting relocation wrong could cause project delays and increases in construction costs, but also human capital costs. Having to redo things just taxes your resources even more. Or if you get off on the wrong foot to begin with, you could put a project that otherwise would go off without a hitch really, really behind the 8-ball. And again, by not taking care of people, you're doing the wrong thing, right? And you start not taking care of people by not having the level of empathy and compassion that you need to while you're putting them through this process. In my mind, just working through these things on a daily basis and being around long enough, what's most confusing to me for folks is which set of rules apply and how to apply them. Do we need to follow the Uniform Act? Do we not? Do we need to follow the Section 18 guidelines? Do we not? People get really confused on what's required of them and what's not, because if you just read the law or the regulations, it's not always clear on when you're triggering it and what you have to do once you do. that's probably the biggest thing, is when, kind of what rules and when to apply, and how they're actually applied so it's correct. How to staff your relocation team. I've had a lot of experiences where I've stepped in and taken, as the staffing was, as I call it, undercooked. The relocation team was a sort of combination of different folks in the office and some property management folks, some maintenance folks, and the relocation of the residents became kind of one of their things that they did, but not their focus. The intensity of relocation at times requires full-time dedicated team working solely on that and dedicated to that. And so I think people are often confused of how to properly staff, train, motivate and manage a relocation team. And then the last two things is when and how to start and when and how to plan. And we're going to touch on those in a minute as well. I want to pause from the slides for just a second. I want to make sure I'm not ignoring anybody that's got a question in the chat, or haven't let anybody in. Looks like we're okay. Hopefully everything's going great. Feel free to shoot me a question or a comment in the chat. I'll be checking that periodically. Okay, so moving on from what's confusing. Some relocation triggers. The first one is the use of federal funding in a conversion and or development project. Development project meaning a renovation, a total tear down and rebuild, a tear down and no build. Maybe the land's being vacated and sold off to for another use. That's a project. That's a development project. And so when you use this federal funds in that project and people have to move, you're going to trigger some kind of relocation requirement. And we're going to talk about the different sources of funding here in a second. Use of federal assistance in a conversion and or development project, and people have to move, right? And that's always the key in figuring out if you've triggered something is, are you using federal money and are you requiring people to move? Or do you have some other kind of federal participation and requiring people to move? For example, the HUD 8BB transfer it's not really a new source of federal money, but HUD's allowing the transfer of that housing assistance payment contract to another site. And so they're facilitating its federal participation, and it has its own relocation rules, right? So we'll go through those in a little bit. Just to give you more clarity on what I'm talking about is the difference between assistance versus funding. You could also have state and local requirements. I'm not sure about within Kansas, but I've worked in a number of markets across the country that have state housing finance agencies have requirements of developers, including a housing authority, that go either go above and beyond the Uniform Relocation Act, or they support it. Texas and Georgia are two that come to mind. Most state housing finance agencies want to see a relocation plan with a tax credit application. And certainly if you're going to pursue federal money through them, again, they're going to see a relocation plan and what your approach is. But at times you'll see local requirements as well, just to get building permits or demo permits. It's one of the first things that I do when I take on a project in a market. Even if I've worked there before, I always check with the state and local folks to see, is there anything else that's going to be required or not? And if it is, then we've got to follow it. If it's not, then I'm real clear in my planning documents that those local requirements aren't triggered, just so that everybody's aware of what's going on. A little deeper dive into triggers. Again, the URA is triggered when folks have to move as a result of the use of federal funds or programs for a conversion or development project. Could include a RAD conversion, could include the use of home or CDBG, National Housing Trust Fund dollars, even the renewal or extension or assignment of a project-based voucher or a project-based rental assistant contract is a new source of federal funding in a development project. And so all of these types of sources trigger the Uniform Act, and in certain instances also have some additional requirements on them. The Section 18 demo dispo process does not trigger the Uniform Act, but it has its own rules. Section 32, which is a HUD home ownership program, also does not trigger the URA as far as I'm aware, but it has relocation requirements similar to the URA. An example of a Section 32 project is I'm seeing some scattered site housing that's being converted to home ownership opportunities, and it may necessitate the vacation of the existing household. And so that household now needs assistance to relocate. LIHTC alone, that's low-income housing tax credit, does not trigger the Uniform Act. And I put here, unless Kansas law or Kansas housing says so. Several states have taken the stance that a public agency that is going to use low-income housing tax credits in a development project has to follow the Uniform Relocation Act. The state of Oregon has a similar law. The state of Utah has requirements along those lines. The state of Colorado has effectively gone that way, as is Arizona, because of the way they finance deals. There's often gap money that's put in. In my research, getting ready for the presentation, I didn't see that kind of requirement in Kansas, but you never know, and it's always worth to ask. So if you're going to go forth and pursue low-income housing tax credit financing for a project, really good to talk to Kansas Housing early on and make sure that you've got a clear understanding of what they're going to require of you and whether or not they may require you to follow the Uniform Act, even though you're not using federal funds. So again, I think I'll do a quick pause. I'm just going to check the chat here, see if anything's come up question-wise. I don't see any, but see, we've got 9 people, so thanks. Thanks again for showing up and participating. And feel free to type in stuff in the chat. Specific questions. We can get into some real-world situations. If you're looking at a project, you're looking at a RAD conversion or Section 18 disposition, you want to pick my brain, I'm here for you, and happy to try to help you sort some things out today if you like. My mantra on relocation is, I call it R3: do what's required, do what's reasonable based on the folks that you're working with, the households and their needs, and you're going to end up right, as in correct. You will have done relocation right, and you will have taken care of people. For me, this is something to easily remember, and to me, its real meaning is you're never going to be able to avoid the law and the regulations, right? You got to do those no matter what. So that's number one. That's going to be your sort of minimal guidance. Within the law and the regulations, though, there's not a lot of very specifics of sort of how to, right? The regulations talk about money, timelines, sort of if-then triggers, but they don't talk about what you have to do, from item 1 to 100, if you will, based on the type of project. So that's the stuff you got to figure out, is based on your resident population, the type of project, the level of impact on folks, the level of assistance that they may need is really going to drive the reasonableness part of this. And to give you an idea on a reasonable, um, I've got a project right now where public housing, they're not going RAD, they're just going to tear it down and rebuild it. And so everybody's current public housing tenant, the Uniform Act says all you need to do is provide a housing choice voucher if they're eligible. And in this case, everybody is extremely low income and eligible for a housing choice voucher. Everybody's well below 50%, 80% AMI. What the Uniform Act, though, doesn't get into, though, is whether or not you got to pay for their security deposit and application fees. And I can tell you on this project, don't have anybody that's cash rich and has $500 to $1,000, which is the going rate for a security deposit in the community I'm working in, to pay for a security deposit. And so that's been my recommendation to my agency client is you're going to have to pay those costs because otherwise you're not going to successfully get folks to move. And they may have to really go through a hardship and do something crazy like take a payday loan or something else just to pay the $500 security deposit. So that's a reasonable approach for a benefit that the Uniform Act doesn't specify, but yet for that population, which I suspect is most public housing populations, will need to be successfully relocated. And so, we're doing the law, we're doing the reasonable, and so ultimately we're going to be right because we thought through what people really need to make this successful and not put them in a worse position than when we started. Some basic Uniform Act requirements, planning. So Uniform Act says do planning. They don't necessarily say write a plan, but my message is write a plan. A relocation plan, a single document that captures description of your project, description of your resident population, who's going to be responsible for delivering services and specifically what they're going to do. Your high-level schedule and your cost estimate are very important, guidelines that everybody needs to be aware of and needs to follow. And if you've got them in one, succinct, plan, then you're in good shape. Otherwise you got sort of varying thoughts on what we think we're going to have to do. Just write the plan, and that'll meet your planning requirement. Resident engagement is required. Resident engagement typically means a couple town hall meetings and some one-on-one interviews. The one-on-one interview is really what's required under the Uniform Act, but I've found it very hard to get people to show up and participate in a one-on-one meeting when they're being blindsided by what's happening. And so doing a town hall meeting is a powerful tool. It's obviously been a little challenging doing town halls in the age of COVID. We're not through it. Every committee is a little bit different on where they're at in terms of their numbers. And so when are we going to be seeing large town hall meetings again? I'm not sure, but there's some alternatives. Some things that I've done that work are setting up project websites or utilizing existing websites and posting videos on that website or just creating a YouTube channel for the project and posting short 5-10 minute videos that people can watch. Video on description of the project, a description of how it's going to impact them, a description of how the relocation program looks for them, and then how to get in contact with somebody. Those are good, powerful tools. They're not 100% going to reach everybody, and so you're going to have to kind of monitor and work through. But that resident engagement piece is critical. There isn't really anything that you would do that you're going to be able to get away with not doing resident engagement. Certainly, you've got to do the one-on-one conversation, but you really have to go further beyond. Section 18 definitely requires it, as does RAD. So the big conversion programs do, but even just pursuing a project where you're going to use home or CDBG, and you're going to be applying for funds at some point, most of the time somebody wants to see that you've done some outreach and you've done some kind of, engagement on a larger scale beyond just meeting with folks one-on-one. URA requires advisory services, and in fact, this may be one of the most important elements, because you can't document that you've properly advised people. You certainly may have a problem collecting your program funding at the end that you're counting on to fund your project. And what I mean by advisory services, it really does start with that planning and outreach piece and early notifications like the general information notice, giving people brochures or flyers, descriptive things that explain the process in writing, but also being available to them on their time and not just yours to answer their questions. If you try to treat relocation like an 8 to 5 activity, you're going to miss people. So you have to have folks available that can meet with people in the evenings and the weekends. A lot of residents now have become very comfortable doing, email and text. And so being responsive to those emails and texts is all part of the advisory services process. There's a formal process and there's an informal process. And it's very important. It's probably one of the most critical things you got to be ready to staff that, and you got to be ready to deliver it. There's financial assistance. There's assistance for the move. There could also be assistance with housing costs. If you're able to issue housing choice vouchers, that typically is going to cover the majority, if not the total increase of somebody's out-of-pocket housing cost. But there may be some additional monies that they're eligible for. And that's a session unto itself and almost a whole day class calculating costs. But just know that you may have some rental assistance costs that could go beyond the housing choice voucher. And then the closeout process, the process of making sure that everything was well documented, the files are in order, and you tell an understandable story on each one of those files for each resident. Each resident has to have their own file. A bucket of paperwork for the entire project doesn't work. You got to have a file for everybody, and that file has to tell a story. And so that's really where the closeout process comes in. You should always be documenting along the way, but that good closeout process is really necessary so that you're ready for a review or an audit of those files if it comes down to that, which it could. So getting a little bit further into the weeds on these requirements, first up is planning. I tell people hope is not a plan, right? A plan is a plan. You really got to think about this stuff and how you're going to execute it and document your process. And also review that process as you go along through the project. And, are the measures that you planned on taking, are they adequate? Are they meeting the needs of residents? Are things clear or are they not? Do you need to add in some additional written notifications? Do you need to add in some additional meetings? That whole planning process really goes throughout the cycle of it. But content-wise for a relocation plan, it's got to be more in a paragraph. You're not going to get it done in a paragraph. You really have to take time to describe the people that are impacted, your project requirements, funding, all these things, to have a good, solid relocation plan, and talk about, who's going to do it, who's going to be there for them, and what are they going to do. And resident input involvement, to me, is critical for having a good plan. Having an opportunity for them to ask questions, how this is going to work, and clarify them within the body of that plan is a great tool. Resident engagement, we kind of talked about this off the slide already, but town hall meetings, one-on-one surveys, alluded to COVID-19 with large town hall meetings. COVID's really put a strain on doing one-on-one conversations as well. I'm used to doing them in people's homes at their kitchen table or on the front stoop, but it's not been safe for a while to do that. or if it has been, people aren't quite yet comfortable. And so I've been able to meet with people in person, but I'm also advising them that, hey, I'm going to wear a mask for your safety and mine. Want you to wear a mask. We're not going to sit right next to each other. So I give people instructions beforehand, because I'd like to meet with them in person and get to know them a little bit. But if we can't because they're not comfortable or the conditions just aren't right, it's okay to do them by phone. You can kind of get it done through email exchanges. Online tools work versus in person. One way or the other, you're gonna have to get personal. You're gonna have to learn about them. You're gonna have to collect primary information from them that goes beyond what you have in your files, because you're gonna have to plan to individually work with them and understand, what does the household need. Do they have disabled members? Do they have, thinking about a renovation project? The work is going to happen during the day, but do they work at night and sleep during the day? And so different accommodations going to have to be made for them. All that stuff you have to figure out with them, and the best way to do it is one-on-one interview. And if you can't do it in person, here's a couple of tools that work to get it done, to get the information you need. Push and pull information. Right? You may push out information in newsletters and video presentations, and then provide other information for residents to pull in their own time. Kind of a repository, or if you will, and make things available to them. Direct delivery is the best, but to be efficient at times, I'll also just kind of push things out and have things available and then follow up with folks as we go along. I want to check the chat here real quick and see if anybody's got a question. I see nothing. Okay. Next up, advisory services. So that really critical piece I was talking about really, again, builds off of the resident engagement. You have to advise folks of their rights. It's done formally through written notices, handouts, flyers, those kinds of things. But also just, informally through periodic check-ins, folks dropping in and visiting with you, or you visiting with them, responding to, the text, things like that. I mean, that's all forms of informal communication, and documenting this advisory service is really key. It's really critical in the files to show how it was done, and that there was an exchange there between the relocation team and the person that's being relocated or displaced. A couple critical notifications. So this fits along with the advisory services. Critical notifications and timelines. The general information notice for under the NRA is a big one, because what that notice does, it advises people that there may be a project. It doesn't make them eligible. It doesn't tell them to move. It just advises them of the potential of a project that may impact them, and other information that's going to be important to them. And in fact, that letter tells people, don't move. Stay put until you get further notice. There's going to be more to come. And the law, this is one of those cases where the law is not very clear on when. It says as soon as possible. But as soon as possible to me and as soon as possible to you is a different thing. Most of the time, you're going to have to do it before an application for funding goes in. So let's say you've got to apply for home or CDBG. You will need to done that general information notice service before you submit that application, because you're going to have to prove that you served that notice to all the people impacted. And that notice has to be addressed to that household, and as I state them, all their adult members. It has to be dated, and it's got to be either sent through certified mail, and they accept the certified letter and you get the return receipt back, or you have to hand deliver it and get their signature on that specific notice. More often than not, what I see, I'll pick on you guys a little bit, but I see a lot of housing authorities will print out something that off Google It is a general information notice, but it's not dated to anybody specific. It's not, it doesn't have a date on it, and it wasn't acknowledged as being received by the resident. A lot of times you've got a staff person walking down the hall, taping it to the door and putting a check mark on a rent roll. That's not sufficient. You have got to serve this notice and be able to prove that you did to the specific household. And that goes with every other notification that's involved in this. Date it, address it to the specific household, and be able to prove that you served it. Unless it's a general flyer about a meeting, everything's got to be addressed to them. Notice of non-displacement. So if you're doing a renovation project and folks are moving out temporarily, in addition to the general information notice, you have to serve a notice of non-displacement. And again, this is an as soon as possible notice, but it's served as soon as possible once you know that a permanent displacement is not going to occur, right? So folks are able to come back. You can do a combination general information notice, notice of non-displacement. HUD doesn't necessarily like that, but if it's clear that you're not displacing anybody and you're very clear in providing the same information that you would provide in two different notices in one, you've got a serviceable document. But at times you don't know. And so it's a more conservative and probably a better approach to serve the general information notice as soon as you know you have a project that may require a relocation down the road. And then once you know you're not going to displace anybody, then serve that notice of non-displacement. And again, that notice of non-displacement has to be served individually to folks, addressed to them, and they have to acknowledge receiving it. There's different relocation brochures that need to be given to folks. I tend to like to give that during the interview, and it's a great way to walk people through the program. There's some very generalized relocation brochures that HUD has put together. My advice is to read through those and then get specific on what your project is and how you're going to help folks, right? And again, you need a form of acknowledgement for that household receiving it. Very important. Eligibility notices, and so the eligibility notice lays out specifically what a household is going to receive. What kind of moving services, what kind of housing assistance, a better description of advisory notices. That's got to be given prior to a notice to vacate. So you can't give the notice to vacate and then 2 months later give them an eligibility letter. You've got to give the eligibility letter either before or at the same time as that 90-day notice to vacate. And this runs a little counter, especially when working on projects where there's vouchers involved. A lot of times the voucher is good for 60 days when it's issued. It has to be deployed, but yet you've got to give folks 90 days notice. Well, what that ought to tell you early on is you're going to be giving folks 90 days to utilize that voucher, or you're going to be given a 30-day extension to them if they use all 90 days to move out. So it's one of those nuanced things that you really have to kind of calibrate your program. And again, that's a value of doing a really good thorough relocation plan on the front end. Figure out all the stuff you got to do first, right? Document in a well-written plan, come up with a good schedule on how you're going to do it, and then get going, as opposed to working the opposite direction. And then vacate notices. The minimum is 90 days for permanent relocation. If you're doing a temporary relocation and it's less than 6 months, you can give folks a 30-day notice to vacate. A lot of agencies like to give the 90-day no matter what, and that's okay. But just know that there's some flexibility with temporary relocation that you don't have with permanent. You can give more notice. Also, just thinking about working with vouchers in a lot of markets, especially when you're dealing with larger households, the supply of housing just may not be available to effectively get somebody moved in a 90-day period. And again, going back to that plan, if you've done a good thorough analysis of the housing market and you understand what's going to be needed for those households and how you're going to address it, it may determine that you give more notice above and beyond that 90 days. I was having a conversation with a housing authority director in Pennsylvania last week, and she recognized in her community, she's got a lot of households in 4 and 5 bedroom units that are not, they're not under house. They legitimately need that size of a unit. But the market doesn't have enough inventory to house all those folks. So she knows she's going to have to give more notice. She's also going to have to do some other things. But so just keep that in mind. These are minimum timeframes and not all you can give. You can give more, you cannot give less. A couple of other things on the advisory service topic. You've got to give referrals to replacement and or temporary housing to folks. So what the law says is you have to, with the eligibility letter, you've got to base their relocation entitlement on a unique comparable. And so that's one. And then throughout the remainder of the 90-day period, you got to give them at least 2. Ideally, you're given 3 referrals at the beginning, so that people have access to a lot of information. 3 or more, actually, and so they've got access to a lot of information and can make a good decision. I hear a lot of times folks using the term 3 options, and it's not incorrect. I mean, it may be splitting hairs a little bit, but the folks get to choose where they want to live. And to me, an option is like, A, B, or C. You got to pick one of those 3. When in reality is you're giving them information on 3 units that are available in the market at the time that you give them the information. They can choose to go find a different place, right? There may be some parameters there that they can't go beyond, or if they do, then either they're not going to get approval or it's not going to be accepted. But options is really an incorrect term, but it's frequently used. It's referrals to replacement housing. That's really what you're doing. You're referring them, you're giving them information on available units in the market. With temporary housing, a lot of times I'm coordinating that. I'm lining up a master lease on another apartment property or using other units within a client's portfolio. And so the resident's not responsible for finding temporary housing, but have seen cases where the residents are made responsible to go out and find their temporary housing. And if that's the case, again, you've got to give them referral to those locations. Again, I'm going to go back to the plan. You really want to think through what can you and can you not do if you're doing temporary relocation. What's actually feasible. One of those may be that you don't have enough time in your construction schedule to leave folks to their own devices to go find temporary housing during the renovation. And if that's the case, then you're going to have to control that process a lot more and locate that housing and place them into it if you're doing temporary relocation. And if that's confusing, please throw a question up on chat. Last point here is, periodically through the relocation process, folks will need something beyond housing and moving assistance. They may really be having a tough time coping with the concept of moving from their neighborhood, moving away from their neighbors, not working with the same property manager, all those things. And so I've had a lot of experiences where referred folks to almost grief counseling over relocation, or they've been in their unit for a really long time, and they have pets. The pets could be service animals. Now they're going to move, and the landlords are going to need to take the dog if it's a service animal or cat or whatever it is, but they may not have the proper documentation for that animal. So you may need to refer them, to the the proper folks to issue them an approval that animal is a service animal. Things like that. That's what I'm getting at with social services and other needs. You may have to explain lots of other things. These programs are confusing. It's not a typical thing for people to have to go through one of these events, and get the family ready to move, and at the same time understand how they're going to be compensated. So never assume that people understand what the program is. Never assume that they know what the expectations of them are, and never assume that they know how you do business in terms of a relocation. You have to explain those things. You should do it in writing. You should be explaining it in one-on-one conversations, and you should be doing follow-ups. That's all part of advisory services for relocation. And again, going back to staffing, you got to have staffing that's actually available to folks to be responsive to them and their needs. Last item on this this string of requirements is the closeout. I talked on this earlier already, but you got to maintain a file for each household. You need to be reviewing it and ensuring that any deficiencies are corrected. You could be audited. You could be audited by HUD. You could be audited by State Housing Finance Agency, and you want to be ready for those audits. And so, a good, thorough closeout of those files is required. Like I say, always be closing. Always be working on the files as if you've got to turn it over to an auditor tomorrow. Don't skimp on that. Devote the time that's needed to have those files always in good shape and always ready for review. Seen some, especially with RAD conversions and Section 18 now, projects that use both conversion methods. There's some layering and some nuance that goes along with that. And one of those is, even just the simple idea of, if you read the law, you could be led to think that you have to provide a ton of money to everybody no matter what. Again, if you're displacing folks from public housing, a housing choice voucher satisfies the obligation for replacement housing, unless the household's doesn't qualify for it, right? But a housing choice voucher covers that for the replacement housing assistance, and you're not going to be forking out major sums of money to move them from public housing to a penthouse unit. All right, you'll meet your obligation with a housing choice voucher. If they don't meet the requirement, or if they're not eligible for a housing choice voucher, you think about folks that are flat renters, or may have gotten to a point where their income now exceeds 80%. Then you're going to be working with them a little bit different from everybody else, and that's okay. It's not a fair housing issue. It's just a different scenario with that household because of their income, right? So you inevitably will treat everybody a little bit differently payment-wise, because not everybody's got the same household size, not everybody has the same income. Everybody's going to require something a little different. And that's a question I get a lot of, well, don't we have to treat everybody the same? Like, you have to give them the same level of service. You don't want to do anything that's discriminatory, but when it comes to payment and what people actually need to get through this successfully, that's going to look a little bit different for everybody. When federal funds are used, the URA is the dominant regulation. Again, a RAD Section 18 blend. URA is still triggered. Section 18 does not trump the URA. RAD triggers the URA. So if you're doing a RAD conversion combined with Section 18, you're going to follow the URA. You're not going to follow the URA on a portion of the units and Section 18 on the rest. You're going to apply the Uniform Act to the entire project. And again, you've got to really focus and make sure that you're following the right program requirements and everything that's required. Because home has a couple extra details you got to follow on top of the Uniform Act. RAD certainly does, and so you got to make sure that you're following everything. So you really got to go through and reconcile all the requirements and make sure that you're meeting every one of them for everything that's involved in your project as you're working through relocations. But again, early planning is crucial to that. Figure out what your funding is, figure out what your requirements are, write a detailed plan so that you've got a great guide as you go along and nobody's lost. And then update the plan. You know, if you add something or you take something away, update your plan so that it's very clear what's going to have to be done. You know, a couple other programs. So we've talked so far about, I'll say sort of garden variety Uniform Act, sort of big picture stuff. But now I want to focus a little bit on specific conversion tools that are being used, specific programs when there's public and affordable housing involved. RAD, certainly Section 18. Section 104D is triggered when you use home or CDBG dollars, as we'll talk about in a minute. And then Section 8BB, which is a housing assistance payment transfer process or tool that's available that I'm starting to see some agencies utilize. So first up, RAD. We'll talk about RAD in detail. Early on, I've been working on RAD since 2012. I worked with Fresno County Housing Authority. I was one of the first agencies to adopt and you know, take steps to convert their entire public housing portfolio to either project-based vouchers or project-based rental assistance. And at the time, the rules were not very well written of what you had to do for relocation, other than the Uniform Act was triggered. You know, that's always been the case. Yet I heard even then, and even now, that, well, we're just doing RAD, so you know we don't have Uniform Act requirements. Like, no, you're actually incorrect. You're doing RAD, and because you're doing RAD, you're also triggering the Uniform Act if you're going to require people to permanently or temporarily relocate, right? So RAD does not eliminate URA requirements. It triggers them, and there's enhancements to what you're going to have to do, and other protections. One of those is all residents have the right to return, and that's regardless of you know, renovation, demolition. It's regardless of what their income qualification for the property is. Right, so I'll give you a couple of examples. Have worked on a couple of projects where the units were demolished and rebuilt, and construction was about 18 to 24 months. RAD says you can't displace anybody, and so what that means is you have to offer them an option for long-term temporary relocation. So the option to come, you know, to get assistance while they're moved away from the property for the project. And then once the project's done and there's a unit that's available to them, then offer the right to return and get resettled in. And if they happen to be 120% AMI and it's a tax credit property, you've got to reserve units for them to reside in. That's a requirement of RAD. And that's where there's some conflict and some mismatch between low-income housing tax credits and RAD. You can offer that same household that's over income a voluntary permanent relocation package, if you will. You can, you know, you follow the Uniform Act in calculating their replacement housing payment. You follow the Uniform Act in determining what their moving expenses are going to be and what kind of advisory services you're going to provide them. You put that into a notification to them, and they get 30 days to consider what it is they're going to do. And if they choose that package and move away, then in writing, they've been told that they're going to forfeit that right to return, right? It no longer applies. They've opted to move away. If they want to come back, then you're going to have to work with them to get them housed there and work with them during temporary relocation. So that's a nuance of RAD that is not called out in the Uniform Act. And again, there's a little bit of a conflict with tax credits and RAD. So be mindful of that if you're considering RAD. RAD requires that you cannot relocate anybody until you receive a RAD conversion commitment, or RCC. unless you've gotten prior approval from the transaction manager to do so. But everything I've been involved in, nobody's getting authorization to start relocation prior to the RCC. Because you can think about it in this light, that the RCC is the commitment. It's what triggers that HUD is going to provide either project-based voucher or project-based rental assistance to that former public housing site, right? So they committed, now you've got a project, now you're going to move forward, now you're going to need to relocate folks. And so what HUD doesn't want is people getting a jump start on this, vacating a property prematurely. You know, for some reason, something's not going to go through. You know, there's a lot of cases where chaps have been given and then given back to HUD. And so if, you know, the property is getting vacated before the RCC, you've now displaced people on a property prematurely and not necessarily. So HUD's trying to avoid that. So keep that in mind. And that could change your, you know, your construction timing. You know, it could really jeopardize it. So again, going back to planning, you have to understand what your schedule is for the RAD conversion and receiving that RCC. What's your schedule going to be for starting construction, and how does that impact when you can, or when, you know, when you start relocation? How is that going to impact construction? You know, might you end up with have a mix of folks moving around on the site until they get settled elsewhere? All kinds of things can come up. So just things to be considerate of this. RAD requires that you turn in a relocation plan, you know, before or with your financing plan. I advise don't wait. Start early. You know, work through it progressively so that you're starting to understand your schedule and your costs, right? And then finalize it as you need to turn in with your financing plan. You can transfer you know, RAD to other properties that you control. You know, I say be careful though, because there's some, you know, should be some limits to that. You know, for example, I had a housing authority client many years ago, and they were going to transfer assistance from a property, from one property to another, and the receiving property was like 30 miles away. And they expected everybody would just be transferred over to that property with no questions asked. It's like, well, that's not going to work. And the, you know, transaction manager was pretty much on board with that. They're like, yeah, if they voluntarily decide to move to this new property that's 30 miles away, that's okay. But you have to make sure that they understand their options for other assistance, which could include voluntary permanent relocation package elsewhere with or without a voucher. So again, understand what you're doing first, because there's some creative stuff you can do with RAD, but there's some things that really could, you know, cause you problems and trigger a lot of additional relocation activity that you weren't expecting. Section 18. Section 18 by itself does not trigger the Uniform Act. Okay, if you're doing a demo dispo application, and, you know, let's say you've got a bunch of scattered site public housing and it's become just a beast to manage, and you want to get out of that business, you go through the Section 18 application process, and you get approval, and you get tenant protection vouchers, and everybody's got to move out because you're going to sell the houses. That's fine. You're not triggering the Uniform Act when you do that, but you are triggering the Section 18 relocation rules. And what's required there is you have to provide comparable housing. You know, it could be in the form of another public housing unit or voucher. You don't have to do the GIN and the notice of eligibility like you do under the Uniform Act, but I actually recommend it because they're great tools in advising people what's included in the program and what's not. You know, it's really important for people to understand what's out as much as what's involved in the program. Under Section 18, you still have to do a 90-day notice. You still have to give advisory services or mobility counseling, as it's more commonly referred to. And you're still paying actual and reasonable moving cost. And again, if you're mixing RAD and Section 18, now the Section 18 and the RAD is both triggered in the Uniform Act, and you got to follow it. One thing I glossed over here at the top, under Section 18, there isn't a dislocation payment. One of the things under the Uniform Act and a couple of the other regulatory guidelines that are out there, if you're displacing folks from public housing, you're supposed to give them $100 dislocation payment. And the spirit of that is so that folks have money for application fees and other kind of nominal incidental fees. What I found, again, I think I mentioned this early on, what I found is even though Section 18 doesn't require this dislocation payment, I think as a practical matter, I think you're probably going to be providing that assistance anyway. A lot of the projects I've had, it's around a $250 allowance, up to $250 for application fees, and then assistance with security deposit. Unless the property owner's amicable to having the deposit transferred from your unit to the new unit, something like that. Kind of be prepared, even if you're doing Section 18, to still have some kind of a dislocation payment to a former public housing resident, which would be required under the Uniform Act, even though you're not required to do it. Because again, it's a sort of a reasonable, practical thing that I think you're just going to have to do it. Section 104D. So Section 104D, it's kind of like RAD. It's in addition to the Uniform Act requirements. It's not in place of it. It's in addition to. And Section 104D it's part of the Housing and Community Development Act of '74. It's triggered when you use CDBG, home or neighborhood stabilization program funds in a project, and there's demolition or conversion of units occupied by low-income persons. And so if you're going to use if you're going to use CDBG and you're going to tear units down, and you may have some extra benefits going out to folks. I think if you're displacing public housing residents, a lot of this increased assistance is going to be offset by use of vouchers or being able to transfer folks to other public housing units if you've got the ability to do it. Section 104D does require payment of security deposits on top of the other, the rental assistance payment, the moving assistance, all those things. And with Section 104D, there's not a lawful presence requirement. So under the Uniform Act, the household has to self-certify that they are lawfully present in the United States. I think we see this with public housing. I think we see it with Section 8, where there's prorations and things like that. And so if you're just doing straight Uniform Act and you don't have 104D on top of it, then you may be doing some prorated compensation for folks based on lawful presence of the household. If you do have a trigger of 104D because you're using the CDBG or home or something like that, and again, there's a demolition or there's a conversion of a unit. When I say conversion, think about it, maybe you had a unit, you convert it to community space, it gets converted to even commercial space, something like that, a non-housing use, and you triggered 104D, then you're not certifying lawful presence as long as the household is able to certify that they're low income. So a nuance with 104D and something to follow and make sure you understand if you start layering financing into deals where you're creating displacement. One other slide, I'm going to take a slight break and check the chat, see if we got anybody with questions, is Section 8BB. Section 8BB is triggered when you're terminating or you're going to transfer a HAP contract to another property. I'm working on one of these in Colorado right now, and it's interesting because initially I didn't really understand 8BB. It looked kind of like Section 18. There was some language in there that you could trigger the URA, and I wasn't necessarily sure which way to go with my client. so it took me a little bit. I had to reread the requirements, but I've figured it out because we're in the implementation on this. But it really does look a lot like Section 18, where your obligation is to provide housing assistance with a tenant protection voucher or housing choice voucher, moving assistance. But the nuance there is it also talks about other reasonable costs of the move, which Section 18 doesn't really get into, but 8BB does. And to me, what that means is helping with security deposits and some other stuff. So I'm gonna check the chat real quick. We're probably getting close to being to the end, but I don't want to hold anybody too long, so I'll try to go through these last slides fairly quick. 11 folks in, but nothing in chat, doesn't look like. Okay, no big deal. Okay, there's a couple of last slides here to talk about process. Hopefully these are really good tools for you to visualize what you've got to do. I've consolidated things a little bit on this slide, where we're only thinking about a planning and execution and a closing. To me, there's a couple of other layers in there, but we'll go into that. But I think that to be successful in planning relocation, I think you have to start at least 180 days from the time that you're going to require folks to move, right? Because you may need to give yourself time to engage some outside help. You've got to do the general notices. You've got to do meetings, interviews, cost estimating, all this stuff to get to a plan. So give yourself some time. Make sure you're starting this process at least 6 months in advance of when you're going to require folks to move. Then you're going to move into execution, right? You may have to, this is kind of go time, right? It's time to get people moving on. You may have to procure a moving company. You got to ready the tenants. You got to make sure that they're organized, understanding of what's going to be required. Work through their eligibility documents for them, with them, and then obviously give them time to move. Give them that 90 days. And this timeline is more or less based on permanent relocation, as an example. I think you need 120 days. You need 4 months from the date, the last date that you would want somebody in any unit on the property. Work backward 120 days, and that's when you need to start this process. And then the closing process, updating your files and getting everything in order. Again, I say, always be closing. Prepare for a successful close at the start. Set up your files in the planning process. Maintain diaries and logs of communication with every resident at the front end in the planning process, and that way you'll have a successful close. Typically relocation kind of looks like 3 steps: planning, counseling, and then action. A couple elements of that, a couple bullet points. This is kind of minimal activity. It sort of gets you there, follows the rules. You're doing some planning, you're meeting with folks, you're giving them counseling, and then you're helping them find a place to live and handling claims. Minimally this gets it done. What I think is a much better model is this. Define your business case up front, what it is you got to do and why, right? You do some intensive assessment work with the residents very early on. Build relationships with everybody, the displacees, your team. Really get everybody, spend time getting everybody going in the right direction. Have the team working through to a common goal to take care of that resident, and then you're doing constant follow-up. And you see that this is a circle as opposed to just a string of subtasks, right? Because you're following this and kind of rechecking stuff as you go along. To me, that's a much better model than what you saw before. I'll blow through this really quick. Keys for successful people first models of relocation. Time to plan, multiple rounds. You see all this stuff. This is a little bit of a radical idea. This is not prescribed in the law, but just through experience, this is the stuff that works. And it's treating relocation like a project, like a unique activity that needs to be accomplished for your program to be successful. And then a couple things to keep in mind, the kind of the 5 Ps here: potential, people, planning, program, and project. Good stuff. And then, if nothing else, you got this. You can post this on your bulletin board in the office, just to figure out, if you're going to need some help. Could be, pulling folks from other departments, could be going outside, what have you. But, I think if you've never done this, you've got to get some help at some level. If you don't have any staff that you can devote and make it their job to do relocation, you got to get some help. If you've ever gotten in trouble for doing relocation wrong, probably get some help. If you're working with new sources of funding, probably a good idea to check with some folks, maybe some neighboring agencies that have gone through that process, and see what their experience has been. And that's it. That's the slideshow. So, we got some time for Q&A, and hopefully we can get through some of those. Really appreciate Kansas NARO for having me, and you guys for listening to me. Here's my contact. I got all kinds of ways you can get a hold of me. So here it is. The slides are up.